All right, y'all. Welcome to episode 132. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I have with me Dr. Lisa, which I hear that you had some fresh snow. I don't know whether to say
Yep.
yay or boo, but good to be with you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Pronouns are she, hers. We did get a surprise dumping of about 3 or 4 inches in a couple of hours this morning, which I was not anticipating. So I did not get my run in today. But, you know, I guess we will plan for that tomorrow and move things around. But it is what it is. I live in a snowy state. I probably should just stop complaining about it.
No, I hear you, but it's a good excuse to, instead of getting a run in, getting a good little swim in. But I'm a winter swimmer, so I'm always looking for an excuse to go swim. So that's like a non-issue to me. Like swimming is not a big deal. But good for us to get together. I
hmm
know that we have now launched into Women's History Month. See, this is what I tell organizations all the time, Lisa, that seek out our services, our expertise, our experiences about everything that happens during these months from a DEI perspective. It's like you are literally back to back to back to back with lots of events and things in the first quarter. But let me give y'all a quick update on Black History Month, and then we'll move into Women's History Month. So I know y'all recall I have had multiple soapboxes in regards to Black History Month. So I am willing to circle back and give credit to my son's teachers who originally were pulling the name of an athlete and an athlete only, we assumed, right? So I'm looking at Jackie Robinson's life, which should be commended and studied, of course, alongside the Black folks, right? Well, fortunately, the follow up is my oldest son, Trey, his teacher in seventh grade, actually allowed them to select from a list of others. And so my son was able to select Elijah McCoy. Now, this makes complete sense because my son Trey has been a lover of all things trains since he got here. I mean, Thomas the Train, real trains, the Santa train in winter, all of those trains he just loves, which is why we do a lot of Amtrakking, between family and friends. And so he got to do a study of Elijah McCoy, who was a Black man here in the US, but actually traveled to Scotland to study mechanical engineering and get a degree. So he got his degree from University of Edinburgh. He actually patented the process of lubricating the machinery, or at least a lot of the mechanisms that are in what we commonly now use as trains, whether it's electric or coal. And I thought it was pretty cool because uh, if you have learned a lot of American vernacular and you didn't know where it came from, when you hear the phrase the real McCoy, that refers to a Black man, Elijah McCoy, who had the most patents for a Black man at that time. I don't know if that record still stands, but he had so many patents that the US Patent Office at that time, that was closest to him in Lansing, Michigan, actually is renamed after him, the Elijah McCoy US Patent Center. So we learned all kinds of new stuff. So I'm circling back to let y'all know that we got past sports and into inventors. How about that? So exactly what Dr. Lisa said previously, oh, we could have chosen
Right.
inventors. Well, we got there. They must have heard us complain, Lisa.
Yeah, I bet that's exactly what it was.
The teachers must listen to our podcast, right?
I think they do, clearly. So, and they have good taste, obviously.
That's right.
Um, so great update. Good to hear the expansion beyond athletics for the Black History Month project for your kiddos. So let's transition now to Women's History Month. While at least this particular issue is very pertinent to women or any person that is able to have children, at the time of recording, it's about a week ago, but when you're hearing this, it'll be a couple of weeks ago now that the Supreme Court in Alabama, so the Alabama Supreme Court, not the federal Supreme Court of the United States, in all of its glory, decided that it would rule that fertilized embryos are indeed people. And so the destruction of a fertilized embryo would be tantamount to killing a child. And this case, for those who don't know, arose because there were several families who had embryos that were in a freezer. And I'm not sure why someone went to the freezer to get the fertilized embryos, but they did, and then dropped the test tube or whatever they were in on the floor. And so they sued that clinic for wrongful death. And the prior courts that had heard this case had dismissed it or said it's not really a thing. But the Supreme Court in Alabama decided, no, it's definitely a thing. And embryos, even though they're not even in the uterus, are indeed people. And so now this has thrown IVF treatments into a tailspin in Alabama with a number of IVF clinics. I think maybe all of the IVF clinics, as of the time of recording, have closed, and all of these people's plans, whether they were going to have egg retrieval, whether they were about to be implanted, like it's all stopped because of concerns that if any damage happens to any of the embryos, then they could open themselves up to legal challenges for wrongful death. So some families have talked about, well, let's just take my fertilized embryos and take them out of state to another IVF clinic, but people who ship organizations who ship this type of thing don't want to do that either because they're concerned that in that process there could be damage or destruction of those fertilized embryos and it could open them up to litigation. And so, I mean, it's possible by the time you're hearing this things have changed, but I mean literally like head exploding emoji 100 times over, right? I sent the article to my friend in the UK because she studied American studies in undergraduate with me, and she's just like, I mean, it's just absolutely. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous. I see how the trajectory post the overturning of Roe and the Dobbs decision in 2022. Like, I see how we got here, but what is most troubling to me, I guess, is this Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice, I think, who wrote the opinion, quoted from the Bible or referenced the Bible, which just feels highly problematic to me in a country that's founded upon the separation of church and state, and that legal analysis should not be based in a religious text, any religious text, right? So, yeah, so I felt like that was kind of a banner event to happen, on the eve of Women's History Month. But obviously, many people, women and other folks who are pregnant or trying to be pregnant, are dealing with that right now. So I don't know, Shaunna, I'm guessing you have heard of this and you have seen the news and read, and I believe you might have sent me some funny memes, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this particular issue.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's funny in real life at all. I think it's ridiculous in real life. I think what's interesting, especially as a person who I know that I'm in this privileged group called American Protestant Christians, and how it just becomes so convenient. It becomes very convenient to use faith when you want to, but it has to be this one. It always has to be ours. It's never anyone else's. And so I feel like, it's ridiculous to even bring religion into any of this because you're right, the separation of church and state. The other piece too is that again, let's always think about the wraparound. The wraparound to this always sucks. It is the most, again, unidimensional understanding of pro-life anything I've ever seen. And that always becomes the
Mm,
case. It always becomes the case. So, we are willing to let any and everything die for this embryo to live because we consider it a child. But once it's born, once it takes its first
right.
whiff of oxygen, then we no longer care anymore. We don't care that you have nutritious food. We don't care that you have safe neighborhoods. We don't care that
Right.
you have all these other things that wrap around life. And oh, we really don't care whether the birth parent of the child has health care. We don't care about that either, right? And so the person that sees this, that hopefully is a systems thinker, is like, once again, we have a situation where it's not only ridiculous, but it's also not systemic.
Mm,
It's not systemic in any way, shape, or form. And so, you know, I I want to say, let's add this to the list of states where we are no longer surprised on outcomes.
Right. Right.
You and I are no longer surprised on several different states' outcomes on certain things. We know usually it's Florida, Texas-ish, um, but it seems to be a pattern. And so, I think it's ridiculous, and it always seems to be very timely. You know, Women's History Month. How interesting is that? Even though I know birth
Yeah.
parents may not be, but still, it applies to their lives and to their families' lives. And so, it's problematic. It's very problematic. I'm thinking about my friends who do have frozen. I'm like, come on, y'all. Come on. This is now stopping a system until they figure out the system. So I know it's probably going to go further.
Yeah, I think that the implications are ultimately going to end up beyond Alabama, right? Because
Of
other
course.
states are going to see this result, and there's going to
Of
be
course.
additional efforts elsewhere to do the same thing. I mean, it's intellectually consistent. If I identify as pro-life and I believe that life begins at conception, then it follows then that I would say that a fertilized embryo is a child and it needs to be protected. So, I mean, I understand it intellectually, right? But the practical application of it is just mind blowing because you're actually now preventing people from having a family, right? Whereas the whole pro life movement is predicated on wanting to limit either um, to a great degree or entirely access to abortion care and reproductive care in that sense, right? But this is like the opposite thing because these are individuals who are looking to have children, right? Which is something you should supposedly be in favor of. Notwithstanding all of the
All
stuff
about
that you just,
control though,
yeah,
isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah,
It's all about
control.
control because, again, going back to what I was saying about separation of church and state, we're okay with applying church when it's our church. We're okay with it being a family as long as it's our family or our type of family that we approve, which is this nuclear idea of something that is not consistent with possibly the outcomes. So, that's what it is usually, is that it has to be our way or no way. Like, quite literally, our way or no way. That's what's so
Yeah, yeah.
such a power trip with it. That's the power trip for me.
Yeah, that's a really great point, right? That it's only used in religion is used in a particular type of religion is used in a particular type of circumstance, right? When
Yes,
it is most beneficial. And I think this also
absolutely.
opens the door to those arguments around banning contraception, right? This idea that if you're using birth control, you are preventing life from happening. I mean, we're taking it back. That would take it back before even a fertilized egg, right? To you can't use contraception because it is essentially um like a preconception abortion. I'm not really sure, but there's definitely folks who feel strongly about this who also believe that. So that also feels like it comes back to control and power and who has it and who doesn't and which arguments matter, right? And whose lives matter.
Look, I saw a meme that I completely agreed with because I had to laugh to really keep myself together about this whole topic. And it was something to the effect of it had like the thought bubble that comes out, of your brain as you're thinking about something. And it was like it basically said that your thought is now a child. Like, it just went from the thought of conceiving to straight out full blown
Yes.
child.
Right. Right.
And that's, I mean, I
Yeah.
feel like I know that sounds egregious, but yet we're here at egregiousness. Like, things that
Right.
I would never think would happen are now happening
I
to
know.
control whether someone has a family, and if they do, what that family looks like.
Yeah.
That's problematic.
Yeah.
Very problematic.
I mean, you're tracking it backwards, right? So we have the embryo issue, and then we track it back
Yes.
to contraception, and then we track it back to the idea or thinking about having, right? And at what point, like, where are those lines, and what is, who gets to control what choices and what actions? Um, yeah.
Yes.
So I feel like, I just had to have a mini rant about that, especially given that we are on Women's History Month and it's just nonsensical to me. And I know that there's been a huge ripple or tidal wave of many people, on the right of the political spectrum who have come out and said it's too far. So I think things will change with this. I don't know the degree to which they will change or how much this issue is going to spill over, but I think you're right, Shauna. I think it's going to get bigger before it
Yeah,
gets better, probably, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. And how convenient it's now and during a presidential election year, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
It gives candidates an opportunity to yet again go deeper into a already extremely divisive topic. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just serving it right up for them for
Yeah.
another US presidential election. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's shift into phase two, which is another legal topic. Just Shauna and I, went away last week and got our law degrees. So we're like all over this. Um, uh, but for folks who might not know, yesterday at the time of recording last week, if you're listening to this, there was a case that made its way to the Supreme Court related to two state laws in Texas and Florida. There they are again, Shauna, Texas and Florida. In 2021, both states had restricted the ability of social media companies, so like the Facebooks of this world, to remove or edit or moderate in some way content that the social media companies believed to be inciting a riot or harmful or violent or hate speech. And so both of these states are arguing that that is censorship, and it is censorship for conservative viewpoints. And so they passed these laws that have since been on pause. And so now the case got argued at the Supreme Court related to free speech rights. Right. And so I don't necessarily want to talk about the ins and outs of the case, but rather you have social media companies like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. I don't know, all the ones I don't
Yeah.
know about.
TikTok. Yep.
Yeah, and they're private companies, so they're not actually governed by the First Amendment because that's supposed to that addresses government intervention in speech. But
Hmm.
the argument being that these social media companies create like a public square, right? They are the free exchange of ideas. They are widely used. They um, foster public engagement, public communication, and therefore
Mm.
they should not be limiting what speech is allowed in those spaces. That's the argument, right? But the companies are saying we have terms and conditions. We want to make sure that, violence doesn't follow language or commentary that is posted on our sites. Like, we don't want, misinformation, disinformation circulating. Like, that's dangerous. That creates real problems. We know how that can end in terms of people not getting the COVID vaccine, in terms of the January 6th riot on the Capitol, right? So that's their argument. And I guess my question or point that I want to make is this idea of hate speech, what is and is not hate speech, what is and is not harmful speech, has been kind of contentious for a long time, right? In the US context where free speech is enshrined in the Constitution, like, where can that line be drawn and who gets to draw it?
Mm.
I mean,
Hmm.
I feel pretty strongly that content moderation should be happening on these social media platforms when there is misinformation, disinformation, violent language, threats, behavior that is explicitly hateful and harmful, right? Like, I think that's where I stand on it, but I'm not sure, Shauna, if you have a different perspective on it.
No, no, no. I'm with you on that. And I think what's interesting is I perceive, and I may be wrong because this takes a level of self-reflection to understand, but I perceive myself and also you as well as folks who are not so, how can I say, fragile that we can't hear a dissenting view, right? So I'm not the person that says, oh, because I disagree with you, it's hate speech. I'm not that person necessarily. And at the same time, I also am aware of how folks can receive things differently than how they are delivered. And so, given that, if you have extreme cases, extreme individuals that interpret what you say in such a way that it then translates into a violent act of some sort, and we can broadly define violence. It could be more. speech that is hateful. It could be truly harming a human being in their life and everything in between. But if it incites things, that's when I get a little nervous. And so, what I've seen, especially with politicians in this country for years, is that they don't want to take responsibility for the power they have. And so, because they don't want to take responsibility for that power, they think because they say something and someone runs off and takes it to heart and actually commits an act, a crime, a harmful experience for someone else, that it's not their problem and it's not their responsibility. I'm not okay with that. If you want to be in these spaces and places of power, then you have to take responsibility that what you say affects other people to the death, to the life. And so, given that, I think that's where I'm uncomfortable, is that I realize social media is in a precarious place, because think about it. Social media is in a place where they can carry life-giving messages, stories, and information, and then also the opposite. I get they're in a precarious situation. Yet the people that are translating over the interwebs, they aren't taking responsibility for what they say and how it can hit. Like, think about something fun, Lisa. Like, let's say I don't know, your favorite pair of shoes or your favorite pair of jeans, and a star, a famous person, what have you, wears that one thing, and then all of a sudden it's sold out. You can't find it anywhere. They're having to mass produce it because you can't even find it anymore, because that person had so much influence that people acted, right? I remember that, especially the case when President Obama was in office. Michelle Obama could wear literally a $2 pair of shoes and everybody would run out and get it. I mean, for real. She had that type of power and influence. Well, what happens when it's not cool and it's not fun and it's against a particular already marginalized group? And then that translates into bad behavior, bad activities, hateful acts. We can't take responsibility, or we can't take accountability when things go well, but then not take accountability when people take your words and choose violence with them. I'm not okay with that part at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's happening, right? I do think that, I mean, January 6th is a perfect example of it, where you had all of this anger and
Yes,
hate
yes,
and conspiracy circulating on the internet, on these social
yes.
media sites, and then look where that took people. Um, and I, I guess I find it kind of peculiar too that the speech that is being limited by these social media companies is being described as hateful, overtly racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, and then you have like these conservative commentators who are like, you are censoring conservative opinions, and I'm like, why would you want to be aligning yourself, conservative group, with speech that is demonizing and harmful and generally not acceptable? Like, you're like, in the kind of scheme of things here and how history might look back on this, like, you're kind of putting yourself on the side of shitty people who have shitty views, right? Like, I mean, they're not limiting speech that I might find offensive, but is perhaps more intellectual in its approach. Like, they're limiting speech that is using like inflammatory language, like words that describe people that are unacceptable, right? And are generally accepted as unacceptable. So I just think it's kind of a bizarre alignment that you would be making. The
Right,
why, like, from a just purely self-interest, you're trying to appeal to a broad group of people of all racial identities, of all gender identities, so that you can win elections. So then why on earth would you be arguing that these positions are conservative viewpoints? Because I don't think that helps you, like, in
no,
the larger
no,
scheme of things.
no, it doesn't. And they, again, but that comes from country, a history, a culture where it thrives on combativeness. It thrives on, we need to be on somebody's team. It thrives on us versus them concepts. And so, of course, it's like, okay, well, I know that in order to get people on my team, I have to get other people off my team. I need to be clear on how we are polar opposites. And so let me be clear by articulating it this way. And so, we're in a country that doesn't thrive on, as you've, said before on this podcast, we don't thrive on expanding the tent all the time, not even the majority of the time. Usually it is truly, let's create our teams. You align with the team that most aligns with your values, and we go at it until someone wins by whatever rules, even if those rules change. That's
Yeah.
that's where we
Yeah.
are. Yeah. So I agree with you. And it's what did my friend said, I understand the pathology of this country. The pathology of this country is this
Hmm.
trajectory of us versus them. We got to have teams, or else this is not the US unless we have teams.
Yeah, so this us versus them, right? The great state of Texas and Florida against social media companies. It seems like self-defeating, right? You're creating an
Yes.
argument over something that I don't think makes you look very good, right?
Mm-mm.
That I don't
Mm-mm.
think helps your image. So what, you just having a fight because you're annoyed at social media companies, right? Because they limited like COVID conspiracy stuff. I mean, people died because they believed what they read on the internet about the vaccines. They didn't get the vaccines and then they died of COVID, right? Like, I don't,
Mhm.
yeah, that's not conservative speech censorship. That is like protecting people and keeping them alive. Like, I don't, it feels very clear to me.
Yeah. Oh, it feels very clear. But here's the thing though, Lisa, you and I, from our value set and our viewpoint, assume that people care whether other people live or not. And I'm not convinced of that in this country. I wasn't
Yeah,
convinced
yeah,
of it when we
yeah.
when we had conversations about masking. And I personally have not been afraid for myself, but I've shared before, you know, I have sons that go to school every day. I also have elderly parents in their 70s. My grandmother is 98. Even if I didn't have them, if I didn't have them, I would be less concerned with masking. But I care that my family lives. I care that other people live. There are other people that don't care about life, they care about their freedoms. Their freedoms run contradictory to other folks' lives. And so, I'm constantly checking myself on things around, oh, Shaunna, wait. You're expecting other people to think like you think. You care about human beings. Not everyone cares to that level, if at all. And it's such a bitter pill to swallow, but
Right.
everything you said, I 100% agree with. And it's built upon the premise that people actually
Mm,
care about the human community. And that's
right.
not always the case.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely question the motives of these laws
Yes.
and the argument. You're right. Like, it isn't
Yes.
really about, some lauded like principle of free speech and political speech. It's really it's not about that. I think at its base. Yeah. Good
Agreed.
point. Good
Agreed.
point. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Well, let me move us into phase three because I think it overlaps very nicely with what you're mentioning around, hate speech, offensive speech, violent speech, harmful, inciting language. Um, is that I've been thinking more and more. We talked about this on a previous podcast, but I don't think to the extent of a full phase. But this phase three, I wanted to bring back up a kind of a graphic that I've seen before around evolving from violent language that was created by a woman, Anna Taylor. And what I appreciated about the graphic is that we have to really pause and think about how we in this country would have a hard time going through, maybe that's our challenge, Lisa, for ourselves and other people, going through a full 24 hours without using violent language for things, right? And so, for example, if you're in a office setting, a business setting, employee setting, think about a project that you're working on and someone says, all right, well, we're going to pull the trigger on this at noon on Monday, for example. Why we got to pull a trigger, y'all? This is the wrong country to talk about triggers. I'm sorry. We just are, right? Or um, we'll just have to pick our battles on this particular thing. Like, that is a battle is inherently violent. Like, why does it have to be a battle? Like, well, will have to prioritize our values, or we'll have to prioritize something, but does it have to be a battle? I'm not sure. I was even sharing with Lisa prior to logging on and starting the recording around very simple things, like if you're in a document and you're trying to create a list and you use bullets for it, bullet pointed list. Like, do we really have to? Couldn't we use a dot, a square, a arrow, something? Even an arrow is technically violent, but it's part of someone's culture. So, having to slow down and think about how can we rethink language so we're not perpetuating violence in anywhere, whether it's at home, at work, what have you. Can you shoot me an email, for example? Well, why does the email have to be shot? We send emails, we don't shoot emails. And so, just thinking about how we can make sure that the small mustard seed of violent language doesn't grow into other things. And it kind of reminds me of that the hate pyramid, like where things grow. I'm okay with being responsible for my own language and making sure my language is not violent in such a way that it continues to water the growth of violence around me, anywhere
Yeah.
near me in this country. And so I just thought it was something to revisit, given given this particular social media conversation in phase 2. And with you,
Yeah.
in your background and your skill sets in language specifically when it comes to communication, I want to hear your thoughts on it. Am I doing the most on this, or is this a valid thought for us to have?
Oh, I think it's a totally valid thought. I mean, I am just guilty of this too. Maybe even guilty. That kind of pulls up criminal justice, right? Like I've committed a crime,
Ah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, I was just thinking either on the last podcast or the podcast before that, I said something about crosshairs, being in the crosshairs, and before I
Yeah.
said it, when I was formulating the thought, I had that. That's a gun reference. I don't really want to use that. But like my little hamster wheel in my head wasn't moving quick enough to think of something else because I only came up with target, and I'm like, that's not any better. And so then I ended up saying in the crosshairs, I think. And so it's something that we are so immune to
Mm,
the language, and I'm even thinking like on we'll include this the link to this image that we're looking at
yeah.
that kind of gives you examples of what not to say and what you could say instead. But on this list, I'm seeing what's the deadline, right? And I
Oh,
think about deadlines. We have deadlines. And I'm like, okay, so what is it, etymology? How did deadline come to exist? Like, so is it a line in the ground and like there were dead people on one side? Like, I'm curious about that, but I wouldn't necessarily have thought about that as being a quote unquote violent phrase, but it is perhaps, that the history of deadline is probably a bit suspicious, right? So,
yeah. That's a
I
good
think
point.
the other piece I think is, yeah, language matters. How we say things matters. We don't know, we can't control how our messages are understood and then acted upon. And you made
Mhm.
the comment in the previous phase about the responsibility we have, even if we can't control how other people hear our message, we still have a responsibility to think about what it is that we say and be thoughtful about that. But I also wonder at what point do we open ourselves up to a critique of just overreacting, right? Like,
Mm,
these are little things. It doesn't really matter whether you use the word deadline. You're just being oversensitive. You're such a snowflake, Shauna, right? Like,
right,
you know,
right, right.
I mean, I agree in principle that we should de-violence our language. And like, to what degree, right? I guess I don't,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, 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 absolutely. To what degree? And to that point, if we're deviolencing our language, then I think the tipping point for me is, when or at what point have I gotten to a place where I'm callous enough not to be aware of it in
Mm-hmm.
the moment,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I don't want to be unaware of anything that I'm saying. Like, And I don't want to be paranoid either in regards to I'm overthinking. I'm to the point where I almost don't want to speak because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, because you and I work with organizations all the time that we're trying
Right.
to move out of inaction because they're so afraid to do
Yeah.
anything, because
Yeah.
they're afraid it will be offensive, harmful, etc. So I don't want to be in that place of inaction, but yet at the same time, we're critical thinkers up in here. Like we're
Mhm.
calling people, whatever level of thinking that you're at, just take it one more step to think, oh, well, yeah, why do we say that? And isn't there another word that I could use for that
Yeah.
possibly?
Yeah.
Even if it's for nothing but the purpose of expanding your own vocabulary.
Right.
What does it mean to think through another word for a deadline or target or, whatever it
Right.
may be? What's another turn of phrase that can be used? And with that, continuing to make sure that we're not overstepping to a place where we don't want to make any changes at all. Because I see those people that throw their hands up and they're like, all right, I'm not going to say
Yeah.
anything because everything's wrong.
Exactly.
We don't want to go
Exactly.
extreme. But we do want critical thinkers. Think about why we say what we say, how we say it. You and I, we've had lots of conversations about various colors being connected with positive positive things are white and negative things are black or
Right.
brown, or you know I think we're calling people to think more
Right.
deeply than they currently do without putting a big old piece of duct tape over their mouth to not speak at all.
Yeah, I like that nuance, right? It's really about applying a deeper level of care to the
Yes,
language versus
yes,
just policing language for the sake of policing language, right? Like, because we talked about tone policing, right?
that's
So
right.
I do think that there is probably, a good subset of people that, yeah, they throw their hands up in the air and they're like, so I can't use deadline anymore, right? Like,
Right.
and I guess it's less about that and more about, well, maybe think about where that comes from, or even something more obvious like killing two birds with one stone. I have tried to stop saying that, right? I mean, I'm an animal lover, and I'm like, that is horribly violent, right? I don't want to kill two birds with any stones. Right? So there's clearly a different way that I could say that. Like, that's not a win for me, and the phrase is meaning like a win. Where are you going to get these two things done with one action, right? But that, there's more obvious ones, I think, that we could maybe begin there, perhaps.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Oh
yeah,
yeah, for sure.
yeah,
And I'd also lift up another thing too to think about with language is, especially when it's violent language, or especially when it's violent language in already marginalized communities. That's the one that really hits me because, Lisa, I was doing an interview, and the folks that were in the interview were LGBT folks that I was getting their perspective on some things. And I think I used the language of grooming to mean mentoring. So I'm grooming Lisa to succeed me in this role, something like that. And I was not aware, and I was grateful for the care and the kindness that this group provided me by saying, yeah, we might not want to use the language of grooming in the notes, or, as we're sharing about this, because grooming in this particular community means something completely different, right? Grooming meant, for example, pedophiles grooming children to abuse them. And of course, how we know folks try to put the label of pedophiles on the LGBT community, which we know is untrue. And so, given that, I was so grateful for another group sharing with me that language might not be violent in your privileged community, but it is violent in ours, and let us share with you. And they did it with kindness, and they didn't do it in a way that was like, we don't want to have anything to do with you. Hit the off button on Zoom. That's it. Cancel culture, moving on. They called me into the conversation, and I was so grateful and thought it was a model for all of us when we're working
mm,
with getting to know other groups that we're not a part of that are marginalized, and how those words are heavy and interpreted quite different and violently in their groups. It was just a great model that I try to keep in mind
yeah.
with all different types of groups.
Yeah, so I think there's two things here, right? There's language that actually imitates or calls upon kind of violent imagery, right? Like
Absolutely.
shoot me an email. But then there's also
Absolutely.
language that doesn't do that, but feels like an act of violence within the context of marginalization, right? Because it's being
Yes.
used as a
Yes.
weapon, there's the violent word, right?
Yes.
To demonize, harm, hurt already marginalized communities. Because so there's two kinds of ways that violence in language is playing out that you just
Yes.
identified the second one, right? And I think that's also important. That's such an important point because I can use a variety of different catchphrases or words, right? But that do not feel problematic to me, but could land on someone else, which comes back to that responsibility piece, right? So it's not just about saying things that could incite a riot. It's also like not saying things that could hurt someone, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
create a
Mm-hmm.
stereotype or perpetuate a stereotype, right? There's kind of a spectrum really in terms
That's
of
right.
what could happen from those language choices, and especially feeling about that you have been violated or that there's an act of violence. Yeah.
That's right. And then I know we got to wrap it up here, Lisa, but and then let me add this last little piece to it. Don't turn around and duplicate the violence on the individuals that are trying to educate you and help you. Right. So if I had a completely different response to, and I'm not saying my response was perfect at all, but what I'm saying is if I said, well, why is it such a big deal to you all? And, I became a little defensive on it, then that is thereby, duplicating the violence that they're already experiencing from language that I didn't even know was problematic. But now that I do know, I'm defensive and I'm going to double down on it. So, don't exacerbate the harm that was already inadvertently placed on this group or any group once you've been corrected. Thank you. I apologize. Thank you for educating me on this. I'm going to be very cognizant of this moving forward. Something. Come up with something. But you need to come up with some response that
Mm-hmm.
takes responsibility for
Yeah.
the harm and the knowledge that you took.
Yes, I love that. Don't be doubling down. I think that's a great place to end. um,
Absolutely.
yeah, so some hope again, like I think I say this every week, but hopefully some meaty topics for you to think about and chew on and talk about with your friends and your family. If you haven't given much thought to the language choices that you use, then well, you're welcome. Now you have an opportunity to think about that. So,
Uh,
Dr. Shaunna, where can folks find us on the interwebs, on the not offensive, um, hateful interweb options that we have?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So where you can find us, of course, is find us on YouTube, find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Please go to Instagram. You can find us there. LinkedIn. You can. This is what I found out, Lisa. I was not aware that folks can send us messages on our LinkedIn page too. So if you have a question, a thought, a
Excellent.
comment, or something, and you find us on LinkedIn and you follow us, you can also send us a message there. So we can find those quite easily and get them on. And then, of course, you can always see our website, unfazedpodcast.com, where you have access to 115 old episodes and then all the new ones as we've rebranded as Unfazed, Unedited. So if you like today, and you're welcome for helping all of us with violence and language and all these other great things, and especially what a good way to kick off Women's History Month, right? So if you liked all this, make sure you like us, subscribe, share it with your friends, your coworkers, other people that are in this phase of your life. And we'll talk to y'all next week.
See you next week.